And now, your go-to source for year-round fantasy hockey advice, DFS, and betting coverage. This is NHL Fantasy on Ice, presented by Skip, the official food delivery app of the NHL.
T-minus 8 days until the NHL trade deadline, brought to you by our good friends over at Skip. It's time for another episode of NHL Fantasy on Ice, Week 19 Mailbag Edition / 2025 trade deadline preview. Nick Alberga and Jake Hahn with you. What's going on, Jake?
To steal the phrase from my favorite co-host, Nick Alberga, someone make a trade. It's been a little too quiet this week, Nick. Let's get this thing going. So this episode and any trade that comes up soon is brought to you by Skip. Skip to the good part and get groceries, meals, and essentials delivered right to your door on Skip.
The funny thing for me is the biggest name is going to get traded again, it seems, and Mikko Rantanen. How about that?
It's hard to believe. I mean, when I saw that out there, obviously when there's smoke, there's fire. And there was no smoke when Mikko Rantanen initially got traded, right? That one just shook up the hockey world. So now we are seeing speculation of Carolina possibly flipping him. And Nick, I saw Carolina live on Saturday. I know you were there as well. That doesn't look like the Carolina Hurricanes to me. And then they followed it up with a brutal performance in Montreal a couple nights later. Something looks off there in Carolina. So maybe it is time to mix things up and actually do the unthinkable and flip Mikko Rantanen.
Yeah, you know what's off? They know I'm betting on them, clearly, because that's back-to-back games were just a poop sandwich for the Carolina Hurricanes. But you're so right. Watching that game, I forgot Taylor Hall's a Carolina Hurricane. It sounds like they're talking extension with him. And B, Mikko Rantanen was on the ice. I noticed him in the final 10 minutes of that game, but he's just a shell-shocked player right now. And we'll see what happens over the next week. But poor asset management so far by the Carolina Hurricanes. Jam-packed edition of the pod today. We've got mailbag questions. We have NHL Network insider David Pagnotta, the fourth period, for a full deadline preview coming up. And Tim Kalinowski from Snapback Sports will drop by for the On the Money segment brought to you by Bet365. But a bunch of injuries since the last time we spoke. Let's cover that first and foremost here on the pod. Joel Eriksson Ek, it's just been a tough season for him. Jay can't stay healthy. He's down again, so Marco Rossi's the guy I would pick up there.
Well, and Marco Rossi's been a guy all year, whether there's been players in, out of the lineup, no matter where he is. If he's second line, first line, Marco Rossi has been able to produce all season, but this is a tough blow for Minnesota, man. There's few players they can afford to lose more than a Joel Eriksson Ek, right? You look at a Brock Faber on the back end, obviously a Kirill Kaprizov as well. Has any team dealt with as many big injuries as Minnesota, Nick? It feels like every week. The only weeks that we didn't have injury news in Minnesota was the 2 weeks off for Four Nations break when they weren't playing anymore. Like, it just feels like it's a weekly occurrence with Minnesota. So unfortunate. I'm a huge Joel Eriksson Ek fan, but you're right. Marco Rossi seems to be the guy. I don't know if there's anybody else in that lineup, but they are very thin down the middle of the ice right now.
John Hynes deserves a lot more credit for the Jack Adams. I know Spencer Carberry will win that award, but John Hynes has done a masterful job with that team. Some other center options you can pick up off the waiver wire: Pavel Buchnevich, Leo Carlson, Barrett Hayton, Kent Johnson. The New York Rangers interest me a lot leading up to the deadline. What are they going to do? Are they going to stand pat? Been a lot of moving parts to that team. I'm not sold they're going to make the playoffs. And now two more guys down, Chris Kreider and Adam Fox. And of course, a guy like Keandre Miller is a bit banged up right now too. So where would you go on that blue line for the Rangers?
Ooh, that's tricky. Obviously, keep an eye on power play combinations there with those guys out on the back end. Okay, who's getting that first power play look? Because as much as the Rangers haven't been great this year, they should still have a pretty decent first unit, a unit that could get hot at any moment. So I wouldn't mind a piece of that. Maybe they even end up going with 5 forwards. That's a possibility. But I would look at any sort of power play combos there to get some exposure to the power play if I'm looking for help on the back end. I think they could get by without Kreider, Nick. Obviously, if you're a Kreider owner, that's kind of a tough blow. I still think the Rangers have a shot. I don't know what it is. They get a win against the rival Islanders earlier this week, which was nice, step in the right direction, and it's a very competitive race in the East, but something tells me the Rangers still got a run in them even with this injury news.
I think it's Igor Shesterkin, right? If you have the goaltender, they can lead you to the promised land. So we'll see what that team has in store for the next couple weeks. Some other injuries to think about: Roman Josi, Brady Shea would be the logical pickup internally if Josi's forced to miss some time. We saw Drew Doughty miss the game for the LA Kings against the Vancouver Canucks on Wednesday. Jordan Spence had a really good game, so maybe you look at him. On the blue line, Mason Lohrei, we've been touting him for a couple weeks, but I think he's been really, really good. Cam Fowler's been hot for St. Louis again. And Rasmus Ristolainen, of course, Dave Pagnotta, the fourth period's coming up. Ristolainen is a guy who could be dealt in the next couple days here.
Two Masons, going back to our center conversation as well, that I have interest in. You mentioned some replacements for Joel-Eriksson Ek. I don't mind what Mason McTavish has been doing out in Anaheim as well, kind of turning his season around. I think there's some life to that Ducks team. I know I've mentioned it a couple times on the podcast, and you're right. Mason Lohrei getting the opportunity on the back end in Boston, and he's kind of running with it right now and still widely available in a lot of fantasy leagues. So a couple Masons for you there.
Guys, one thing to chime in about Mason Lohrei, among the league leaders in top skating speed, edge stats, 22.5 miles per hour. That's 86th percentile. And even if you look season at large, Charlie McAvoy obviously out indefinitely with the injury from the Four Nations. McAvoy's only got 4 power play points this year, and Lohrei has 12, so he's tripled his total. That's eye-opening there for sure.
Wow. Yeah, he's been such a great piece for them, especially with all the injuries in the back end. Hampus Lindholm and Charlie McAvoy, delivered by Skip. More of a question this week as opposed to like a mailbag per se, but we sort of polled people on who they think could be traded, some fantasy relevant pieces. There's going to be some guys, but the big one for me, again, Jake, is Mikko Rantanen. But guys like Erik Karlsson, Binnington's name's been out there, people putting him into the hat. Brock Besser with the Vancouver Canucks. There's some guys with fantasy appeal that are going to get upside by deals here, I think.
A lot of interesting names there. Binnington jumps out, obviously, as a guy that played a huge factor at Four Nations for Canada. And, if his value, not that it was low before, but it had kind of tapered out, middled out. We hadn't really seen him play any big games in a long time. Now everybody watches him step up in that gold medal game, that huge performance against the U.S. So maybe some interest there if St. Louis would be willing to part with him. What do you think about Besser? Because Vancouver's very much still in this playoff race. They get the big overtime win against LA as well. So would they be okay trading a piece like that off of their roster?
I think it's unlikely. Own rental is probably the way I would phrase it. You never know what Brock Besser is thinking if he's going to test the market, but Vancouver's a team that's going for it right now, and I think they are going to make the playoffs, but certainly a name to monitor, I think, over the next week or so until the deadline, because you just never know with Jim Rutherford. I think he deserves a lot of credit for keeping things entertaining in this league, right?
What about Seth Jones, Nick? I wanted to ask you a little bit about Seth Jones. Some spicy comments this week for his own team and the lack of improvement. I mean, he's not wrong. We have not seen improvement in Chicago, and he's got to own some of that as well for underperforming, making all that big money back there. But do you think there's a world where they could actually move that contract? It's one thing to maybe want Seth Jones if you're another team. It's another thing to make that money work.
5 years, 9.5 sheets per season. That's going to be a very difficult move to make in season, at least in my opinion. I think the player initiated the move, obviously. Now with the comments in the media after that game the other night, we'll see if things are expedited. But I think this is tough for me, Jake, because I think Chicago, there's been so much negativity around this franchise this season. You have to make this move, but you have to get out good, right? And you can't just move Seth Jones for the sake of moving Seth Jones. And that's why I think it's more a deal you're making in the offseason here.
And speaking of offseason, and I know this is looking a little too far ahead, but this is such a massive offseason for the Chicago Blackhawks. They have to fix some things there. And I'm not saying you got to go out and like blow up the whole team or make some crazy changes, but they need to improve. It doesn't look like Bedard's having any fun playing hockey again, Nick. We're having this Bedard conversation. I think it's no points in 3 games out of Four Nations break, only 1 shot on goal in his last 2 games. I hate to harp on Bedard, but it's just been too much of this all season long. Obviously, Seth Jones frustrated there. And he just sounds like a guy that wants the heck out of Chicago. The only problem is he signed that big ticket. He makes so much money that it's very difficult to move him, even if he does want to go.
Well, I know somebody who has the answers to all our questions here on the podcast. First, check out NHL.com/fantasy. Fantasy Spin 2025 NHL Trade Deadline Preview. Pete Jensen did a great job with that, so make sure to go right now at NHL.com/fantasy, to check that out. As we bring in Dave Pagnotta from the Fourth Period NHL Network and NHL Network Radio. What's going on, Dave?
All good, boys. Thanks for having me. How's it going?
Our pleasure. We're doing well. Looking forward to March 7th. Where do you want to start? Any direction you want to go here?
Oh, man. Well, I could tell you, look, going into this week, things have quieted down a little bit. And that's normally 10, 9, 8 days up to the deadline before we hit that week. Where things kind of get quiet. I talked to a bunch of GMs yesterday and some other agents even just to get a sense on both sides. And things have quieted. We're kind of in that game of chicken mode. Who's gonna react first? So everyone's kind of in that waiting period. But things will definitely start to pick up. Certainly, everybody knows who's available. Everybody knows who could be available, what the price tags are, where they could get to. So definitely things are going to be picking up. But everyone knows Seattle's got a bunch of people that are available. St. Louis is listing on a variety of different guys. We know which teams are in the buyer's market. So things are expected to start to heat up. I would imagine Friday on, once we get to a week before the deadline.
Dave, what are the odds Carolina actually does the unthinkable and flips Mikko Rantanen? Initially, if you would have told me that a few weeks ago, I would have thought there's no way. But now it feels like there's a possibility. I got a chance to see them come through Toronto live last week. They just don't look right. They get shut out by Montreal. The fit just hasn't been there, even though it's a small sample size. Do you think this could actually happen?
I don't think it's based on that. I was at that Leaf game as well, and he picked up an assist. That was great, his second with the Canes, but. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a transitional period to get your bearings, and he's been all over the place, on the road, at home, 4 nations, back on the road. It's not going to be because of money, because Carolina's willing to pay him big bucks. The offer was in and around $104 million over 8 years, so they're willing to present him with the dollars. It just comes down to what he wants to do. I think if Carolina feels comfortable, even if they don't get him signed by the 7th of March, if they feel comfortable that they can get him signed by July 1, then he hangs tight. If they feel that he's not going to, if they've been given an indication or feel it in their gut that he's not going to sign there, even after the fact, then I think they start to explore. But right now, it's just, I know it's all hyped up for the time being, but right now it's figure out what you want to do, then we'll go from there. And same with Carolina. They want to know what he's doing before they determine whether or not they're actually going to make him available on the trade market, even though teams have said, hey, if you do it, give us a call. They know their options. They're not exploring them right now.
Who are some other big names available out there?
Well, Braden Shen certainly is generating a ton of attention. Jordan Kyrou, his teammate, if St. Louis does something bigger, I know you guys were talking about some of their guys in Binnington and whatnot, but I think if they do something bigger, hockey trade, talent for talent type of deal, then, Kyrou is somebody that they would explore. So St. Louis is obviously something to watch. Bigger name side of things, obviously Jones, Erik Karlsson, those types of players that are out there. I know there was a report this week about, Karlsson and possibly being linked to Dallas because of familiarity with, the head coach, Pete DeBoer. I looked into that one. I was told it's unlikely to occur. I think if Pittsburgh goes in a different direction, I think they are likely to go in a different direction with Karlsson. And I think Dallas, whether it's Seth Jones that you guys were talking about earlier or Brock Nelson up front, they've got a lot of flexibility with the word that Heiskanen is likely out until the first round of the playoffs. So they're going to be an interesting team to keep tabs on. And we'll see what type of extra sexy names kind of pop up here ahead of the deadline.
Dave, we always talk about who the buyers and the sellers are this time of the year, and a lot of times it's obvious, okay, this team's a legit contender. They've been at the top of their standings all season, or you're in a rebuild and you're clearly a seller. This year, at least in the East, we have a lot of teams kind of in that middle, right, battling for playoff spots that, okay, are you serious? Are you not? Any of those teams we should keep our eye on that they might get aggressive over the next week, a Detroit and Ottawa, maybe one of the older teams in the Rangers or Boston. Which of those teams do you think could end up making a decent splash?
Look, I think from a Rangers perspective, if they're doing anything other than possibly selling out a Ryan Lindgren or somebody like that, if they're adding to their roster, it's more long term. I don't see them entering kind of the rental market by any stretch. I think from the Rangers side of things, if they can think next season and on, or if they can add next season and on, that's where they're thinking. Philadelphia, even though they're a little further back, they're a team that's still of the mindset of a future. They're in that rebuild mode mentally still. And if they can go make another type of hockey type trade, similar to what they did earlier, freeing up some cap space by moving out Farabee and Frost, I think they'd go in that direction. Ottawa wants to add. They don't have a ton of cap space. So they're trying to figure out creative ways to be flexible here, but they'd like to add in their mid-6, and they'd love to add on the back end. They've been looking for a right shot defenseman for some time here. So that's an area to look at. Detroit, if you can figure out what Steve Yzerman's doing, give me a call. It's a little tricky out there, but He's looking as well, and he's also looking long. Like it sounds like they're middle ground, right? Like Detroit would love to continue their push for the playoffs now, but they would also love to be able to add a 2C that's going to help them now and for the foreseeable future. I wonder if they circle back to a guy like Dylan Cousins out of Buffalo. Maybe.
Ooh, is Steve Yzerman and Pat Verbeek friends?
Yes. They are
What was
friends.
that trade the other day, Dave?
Well, it's their farm club in San Diego. They've got injuries in net, so they wanted to make sure that they can kind of stabilize things in goal. Detroit's looking to free up additional cap space, even though Husso was buried. He was still $3.6 million on the books, so gives them a little flexibility. Again, looking more long term. I don't think Detroit's going to make a big splash rental wise, but if they want to bring in a big ticket that's got term, they also have to be cognizant of making sure they're cap compliant this season as well. They've got an extra 3.6 to play with if they need it.
Thought it was interesting. The Boston Bruins, for me, fellas, are the one team I'm looking at this deadline. What do they do? Trent Frederick, I'm looking for value in fantasy hockey. Can he be this year's like Lehkonen or Barbashev, Dave?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. And there are teams that Lehkonen, Colorado brought him in. Colorado's kept tabs on Boston for the last little bit. They're not usually there. Frederick is certainly a guy of interest. Different environment, excel his game even more. Bring that physicality. Bring that extra offense to a contender that so many contenders would love to get their hands on. They've talked, Boston has with his camp, with Justin Brazeau's camp. And I think they basically said, look, we're going to wait until the deadline. And if you're still here, we'll figure it out. If you're not, good luck. So they're listening on both of those guys right now.
Could Nashville still be a player at the deadline in terms of selling off pieces? I know they've teased it a little bit throughout the course of the season, Dave. Barry Trotz just seems obsessed right now with trading fourth liners and American Hockey League players, like these little deals. That just they're not going to get Alberga going, right? Those are the types of deals. He's like, a minute later, someone make a better trade. But could they actually, trade one of these veteran pieces, or is that something they're looking more towards the offseason to assess the roster?
I think, Jake, like a guy like Nyquist is a pending UFA, so he's likely to go. He's got a bit of a big ticket, so that might complicate things. But and he also hasn't performed nearly as well as he did last season. So value is a little iffy there. But, I know Ryan O'Reilly's name is out there. They're willing to do that, but you've got to overpay. Like, they're not going to move out their big pieces. They're going to add. I think Barry's message publicly with the selling and the rebuild and this and that, I think that was trying to light a fire under their butts. It didn't work.
No.
Yeah, they're going to look to next season and the offseason to try to make complementary moves to add to this group, because there have been a lot of factors with Nashville. Like Roman Josi hasn't performed the way he did last season. I mentioned Nyquist. Saros hasn't been remotely close to how he was in the second half of last season when they went on a heater. So all of these different elements could come into play. I think they're going to make some changes by adding to the roster in the summer. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something behind the bench as well, but that wouldn't be until summertime.
I'm loving this great chase. Alex Ovechkin, 12 goals away from passing Gretzky. On top of that, the Capitals are really, really good. That's almost like a sidebar story. What do you expect them to do before the deadline?
They don't want to mess with what they've got too much, but they've got a little bit of cap flexibility because of their LTIR pool. So I think it's in and around 3.6, something like that. Barring any recent call-up, but they've got some flexibility there. And, for a team like that, with how they've performed, you can never have enough depth on the blue line. I wouldn't be surprised if they go out there, add somebody to their bottom pair, or even somebody interchangeable based on situational play come playoff time. I wouldn't be surprised if they add someone on the blue line, and mid-six as well. If they can add somebody as well that's a bit of a physical presence, that can play a bit of a two-way style, I could certainly see that being something that their GM, Brian McClellan, looks to add, because, again, he's got that flexibility. So, do they want to go all out and use up their full space on a guy like Yoel Armia out of Montreal, or do they want to pivot to, a Jake Evans who's at 1.7, or a Ryan Donato out of Chicago at 2 million cap hit? So they've got some options that they're going to explore over these next 7-8 days.
What about the goalie market, Dave? Is there any names we should be keeping our eye on here over the next week? I mean, teams are always looking for a save, whether that's a depth goaltender, like a second or third goalie, or maybe that front-end goaltender. Is there any names we should expect to see out there over the next week?
Well, I mean, John Gibson. It's not a trade deadline without his name out there. So,
Yeah.
we'll see. We'll see if they end up doing it. It's different now. Um, yeah, he's got a $6.4 million cap hit, but Anaheim's willing to eat a chunk of that. So that'll factor into discussions, and then you've got to pay for the value. He's had a much better season this year analytically than he's had over the last little while. Maybe that's because he's motivated to try to get moved to a contender. Um, we'll obviously see there. Stan Bowman this week coming out saying he's comfortable with his goalie. So whether that's giving them support or posturing on the trade market, we got to wait and see there. You could see some teams looking at bringing in some, insurance. You look at San Jose, their guys in net. They've got a bit of a higher price tag in both Georgiev and Vanacek, cap-wise. And San Jose can't retain. They have no more retention slots available this season. But both of those guys are available. And I think Vanacek a little bit more right now in terms of them trying to move somebody out on that or in that crease. But if a team's looking for added insurance, that's an avenue to look at as well. You touched on Binnington earlier. He's got an 18-team no-trade clause or list as part of his no-trade clause. I'd be pretty shocked if St. Louis goes in that direction, but crazier things have happened.
Dave, lastly, we love dominoes this time of year. Who's like the first name you're looking at to fall before all hell breaks loose here?
I mean, yeah, I mentioned earlier, it's quiet. Something's going to drop, and then all of a sudden, all these guys are going to go into panic mode saying, oh, maybe we should have made a phone call earlier. I'm always curious about Lou on the island. Like, he's so set on, where he's at, and he's not talking about it and this, that, and the other, and then everything, and then something just comes out of left field. So whether it's Palmieri or Nelson, we'll kind of see what ends up happening there. I think they're almost resigned to the fact that, okay, we're probably not making the playoffs, and it's probably a decent shot that that's going to be true. So they're going to start looking at that. But from a player side of things, I don't necessarily look at it from that side. I look at the teams. And I could see a team like Vegas trying to make something happen here 6, 7, 8 days ahead of the deadline to really just mess up with the rest of the flow of everybody else. So wouldn't be shocked to see Vegas pull something off here.
Death, taxes, and the Vegas Golden Knights picking up somebody nobody expected. Dave, excellent job. Great coverage, great work, and we'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks, boys.
It's now time for On the Money, brought to you by Bet365. It's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 19 or older. Ontario only. Please play responsibly. If you or someone you know has concerns about gambling, visit ConnexOntario.ca. We welcome in now from Snapback Sports. It is Tim Kalinowski, who was at the Four Nations. What's going on, Tim?
Doing well, fellas. How are you? It's a lot of hockey, a lot of games, little rest, Nick, which means little rest for us.
It's true. And the stretch drive of the Stanley Cup playoffs nearly upon us. But I wanted to ask you about the Four Nations and sort of the return to play. Any trends you've noticed in betting here? Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, look, overs would seem to be the obvious one. I wish I had done a little more homework before I showed up. I wish you were going to ask me about that because I would have been able to pull up for you like at 5.5, at 6, at 6.5, all that sort of stuff. But it was weird. This year I felt, we were in like a really weird under trend, like in the December time, I guess you could look back and say, and we're getting a lot of 5.5 spit at us, and that's always difficult. What do you do about that? But I think the return to play has been one thing, overs, and then another thing is that injuries have really, to me, mattered more. We always see these guys play hard every game, right? So if you're missing one of your better players, it's one of the things that doesn't show up in a short term usually, but I think now because this schedule is so jammed, you are seeing that those, one defenseman's out, that's having a greater impact than it would normally. So I think that's another thing to look out for here.
Boys, I mentioned this a couple times on the pod, but it does feel like the Eastern Conference is just absolutely wide open this year. It's anybody's ball game. Heck, maybe even a team that sneaks into a wild card spot could go on a run. The Capitals have like 100-point gap on everybody at this point. They basically won the conference and home ice advantage. Tim, is there anybody that interests you? Because the Caps are still unproven come playoff time, obviously, at least this version of the Capitals. I'm kind of looking at a Tampa Bay Lightning that has, come out of the break. I mean, they went into the break playing well, come out of the break playing well, tons of guys at Four Nations. Is there anybody there in the East that interests you, maybe from a futures perspective?
No, when I look at teams like, I mean, we're all waiting on what Carolina's going to do here, right? So like that's kind of that's like one of the first chips here. We're all waiting on Carolina, and then I look at that cluster of wild card teams in the Eastern Conference. I mean, you just keep scrolling, and you're like, that team's in it. Wait, that team's in it. I guess that team's in it too. And to me, who's going to make the deadline move, the appropriate one, the one that's the correct fit for them. And on a game-to-game basis, guys, I'm playing dogs in these matchups. When these wild card teams are playing each other, the first thing I'm looking at is their value on the dog, and it seems like a lot of times there is, because they're just beating each other up.
Let's talk team futures, Timmy. The trade deadline, 8 days away. I think you have to be reactionary sometimes, but you got to jump the gun sometimes too. Who are some team futures you're looking at in anticipation of making some moves here prior to the deadline?
Oh, well, I mean, you got to think Carolina, right? Carolina, and then, they were my Stanley Cup pick at the beginning of the season, but they always seem to do something, and that's Vegas, right? They are it's like as good of a bet. It's like the Yankees trying to bid for a slugger in the offseason. The Vegas Golden Knights at the trade deadline, right? So that's a team that you got to feel comfortable with, that they'll be making a move. And then, I feel like a team like Detroit, right? They're sick of being in this little purgatory spot where they are. So I think that there's some real added incentive for Stevie Y there to make a move. So those are three teams, I guess, at the top of my head. But I really have no clue. If you ask my old partner, Michael Leboff, he would say that the Rangers are going to luck into basically Wayne Gretzky 2.0. That's what he would say is going to happen.
Leboff just has to take a side shot at the Rangers somehow.
Yes.
Right? And I know I mentioned to you, Timmy, that I do kind of like Tampa, and I think the Atlantic, you're seeing chinks in the armor from Toronto, Florida, at least inconsistencies. I think Tampa's a team to keep an eye on. Anything you got your eye on for Thursday night? Speaking of Tampa, we get Tampa-Calgary, guys. Anytime I see that, I just think of 2004 Stanley Cup Final, one of my favorite Cup Finals of all time. So Tampa-Calgary go head-to-head tonight. But anything you're looking at on Thursday night, Tim?
Yeah, that's my first Stanley Cup memory that I can remember. So that's always I always think of the same thing as well. Marty St. Louis, Vinny LeCavalier, all those guys. In terms of Thursday night, I'm going to look. I know they've been on a bit of a tough stretch here. The Edmonton Oilers against Florida. I know they're in Florida. I know it's difficult, but I got to think this Edmonton team has to give an effort to get off the schneid here. And when you talk about teams, look, Tampa Bay, not too far away. How many years in a row are we going to be saying this is the end for Tampa Bay? And they just keep hanging around, right? So the biggest thing for me is, can they get Vasilevsky some sort of rest in here with this condensed schedule to help them out in the long run, Jake? I think that'd be something to pay attention to.
Couple more things here. The Cup Final rematch on Thursday night. I will be playing the Edmonton money line in that game. I have played them the last couple games. They've burned me. No Matthew Tkachuk in that game, so I think Edmonton wins, returns favor after Florida won earlier this season. And I want to talk a bit about the Stadium Series game coming up on Saturday at Ohio. Jake, what are you looking at in that game?
Well, very rarely do we see the two teams playing in an outdoor game play each other right before as well. So maybe we get a little bad blood in this game. Look towards I always like the unders in these games. You never really know with ice conditions. If you go back and look through Winter Classics, for the most part, we have seen some unders. I actually think the two that took place at Wrigley both went over, but for the most part, we see unders. So I'll be looking to that, whatever the total might be. And it's funny. I asked him about a Stanley Cup Final rematch from like 2004. I glazed over Edmonton and Florida, which happened a lot more recent. But Philly-Pittsburgh, guys, I'm just going to continue to fade the Penguins. It has nothing really has nothing to do with the Flyers, but I just think the Penguins just look completely lost in their own zone right now. They can't get a save, so I got to go back to the Flyers at basically pick 'em price on Thursday, Timmy.
Yeah, I mean, this Penguins team, really fun watch. I'll tell you that. If you want to continue people, getting in love with the game from the Four Nations, that noon game in Pittsburgh on Saturday after that was great. So, I don't blame you here. I think I would lean with Philadelphia as well. I'm also, it's my favorite team. I'm not afraid to play the Sharks at a plus money price against the Montreal Canadiens on Thursday night. I think those teams are a little closer than what those odds say. And I was looking at, we use the Pickett app over at Snapback, and I was looking, it said my most favorite bet team in the NHL for 2025 has been the San Jose Sharks.
Doesn't surprise me whatsoever. Timmy, thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you, fellas. Thank you.
Breaking news coming in from Bet365, where every nail-biting overtime win, breakaway, pick six, three-point shot, underdog win, buzzer beater, shootout, walk-off, and absolutely every play in between is amazing. From football to basketball and hockey to baseball, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 19 or older, Ontario only. Please play responsibly. If you or someone you know has concerns about gambling, visit ConnexOntario.ca, Jake.
I am by no means an insider, Nick. You're probably a lot more connected than I am. I wouldn't be shocked if we see him maybe break a trade over the next week or so, but keep an eye on Friday night. Friday night seems to be the night. I don't know, for whatever reason, that's when the Rantanen trade happened, and JT Miller, all these things seem to happen on Friday night, and it's been very, very quiet this week, waiting for the big splash, waiting for the big trade. So keep your phone close by on Friday night is all I'm saying. That seems to be when things happen in the league this year.
You got it. I like that you're calling your shot there. Don't forget, coming up on Monday, Week 20 waiver wire edition as we get set for the trade deadline next Friday. Also, I encourage y'all to check out Energy Line with Nate Thompson and Julie Stewart-Binks. Kevin Bieksa was on that podcast. I like that.
Hey, that's a great get there. Kevin Bieksa, always entertaining. Obviously does a great job Saturday night on Hockey Night in Canada. So I'll be sitting back and listening to that. Absolutely.
Great stuff. Many thanks again to Dave Pagnotta and Tim Kalinowski. Thank you to producer Bob Bender. For Jay Kahn and Pete Jensen, I'm Nick Alberga. You've been listening to NHL Fantasy on Ice, delivered by Skip. Skip to the good part and get groceries, meals, and essentials delivered right to your door on Skip.